The next phase didn't begin with confirmation. It began with a claim. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps announced that it had conducted strikes against US Navy-linked vessels and regional military bases. The wording was deliberate. Not carriers destroyed, not fleet neutralized. Instead, Navy-linked. Enough to signal reach, not enough to confirm catastrophic escalation. Almost immediately, ambiguity set in. Were vessels damaged? Were these near-miss demonstrations? Or was this psychological warfare designed to project retaliation without crossing a threshold that would trigger overwhelming response? The geography sharpens the stakes. The Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz remain the epicenter of confrontation. Confined waters where naval assets, commercial shipping, and regional bases exist within tight missile and drone envelopes. Targeting Navy-linked vessels is strategically calibrated. Logistics ships, supply vessels, or auxiliary platforms support carrier strike groups, but are not symbolic flagships. Striking them, or claiming to, sends a message. We can reach your network without directly hitting your core. There's a meaningful distinction between frontline destroyers and support infrastructure. One signals open war. The other signals controlled pressure. This is strategic messaging through ambiguity. So the central question becomes unavoidable. Is this genuine retaliation, the opening of a wider maritime escalation, or calculated brinkmanship designed to test Washington's response without forcing total confrontation? In modern warfare, the most important ships are not always the most visible ones. Fuel tankers, ammunition resupply vessels, intelligence platforms. These are the arteries of naval power. A carrier strike group projects strength, but it depends on a sustainment chain that stretches across ports, sea lanes, and regional bases. Disrupt that chain, and tempo slows. Support ships are also more vulnerable. Unlike heavily escorted destroyers or submarines, auxiliary vessels often operate with lighter defensive layers. Targeting them imposes operational friction without necessarily triggering the political shock of sinking a capital warship. Fixed regional bases present an even clearer vulnerability. Installations in Bahrain, Qatar, or the UAE serve as logistical hubs, maintenance sites, and command nodes. They cannot maneuver. Even limited damage can disrupt sortie generation, refueling cycles, and intelligence operations. This is cost imposition strategy in action. Relatively inexpensive missiles or drones aimed at expensive infrastructure create asymmetric strain. Repair cycles, force protection upgrades, and temporary shutdowns consume time and resources. There's also signaling logic. Striking peripheral nodes communicates capability while avoiding the symbolic threshold of attacking a carrier outright. But escalation logic shifts subtly here. Once infrastructure becomes a target, the conflict moves beyond sea control and into endurance, testing which side can sustain operations longer under pressure. To understand the strike, you have to understand the doctrine behind it. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy was never designed to defeat a carrier strike group in open ocean battle. Its doctrine is asymmetric by design: speed over size, dispersion over concentration, ambiguity over direct confrontation. Central to this playbook are layered missile systems, anti-ship ballistic missiles capable of high-speed descent, cruise missiles hugging the sea surface, and increasingly sophisticated drone swarms that can overwhelm detection grids. These tools are not meant to match US naval firepower symmetrically. They are built to complicate it. Coastal missile batteries positioned along Iran's shoreline provide depth. Many are mobile, shifting locations to avoid preemption. That mobility forces adversaries to search constantly rather than strike confidently. Unmanned aerial vehicles extend the surveillance envelope. UAV reconnaissance feeds targeting data back to coastal units, allowing maritime tracking without exposing larger platforms. Confined waters amplify this strategy. In the narrow Gulf, reaction times shrink and maneuver space tightens. Even small craft or drone incursions can disrupt formations. Iran has tested elements of this approach before through maritime harassment operations. Probing, shadowing, and calibrated pressure short of open war. The strategic logic remains consistent. Deny uncontested dominance, inject uncertainty into planning cycles, and avoid a head-on fleet confrontation where asymmetry disappears. It's not about sinking everything. It's about making control expensive. US naval posture in the Gulf is built around layered presence. Carrier strike groups anchor the formation, supported by guided missile destroyers, cruisers, submarines, and patrol craft operating across the maritime corridor. These ships are equipped with Aegis combat systems, long-range interceptors, close-in weapon systems, and electronic warfare suites designed to defeat incoming threats. Above the surface, carrier-based fighters and surveillance aircraft extend the defensive envelope. ISR platforms track maritime movements, monitor coastal launch sites, and feed real-time data into a shared command network. In theory, this architecture provides depth against missiles, drones, and fast attack craft. But deterrence under pressure exposes seams. Dispersed logistics vessels and regional support nodes are harder to shield than concentrated strike groups. Defending every auxiliary ship and fixed installation stretches defensive bandwidth. Grey zone maritime conflict further complicates response. Rules of engagement require positive identification and proportionality, critical for avoiding accidental escalation. If US-linked vessels or bases were struck, Washington's options range from precision strikes on launch sites to maritime interception operations and cyber countermeasures targeting command networks. The escalation challenge lies in calibration. Respond too forcefully, and the conflict widens. Respond too cautiously, and deterrence credibility erodes. Maintaining dominance at sea is not just about firepower. It's about managing response thresholds in a space where every action is both tactical and political. At first glance, limited strikes on support vessels or regional bases can appear containable. But escalation rarely announces itself in dramatic leaps. It builds incrementally. In a contained scenario, both sides trade calibrated blows, limited missile launches, precision retaliation on launch sites, cyber disruptions, while avoiding direct strikes on high-value assets like carriers or national territory. The objective would be signaling, not expansion. But repeated exchanges compress decision timelines. Another missile salvo, a drone barrage that lands closer to a capital ship, a defensive intercept misread as prelude to larger attack. Each event increases pressure on commanders to respond more decisively. The risk grows when peripheral targets give way to core assets. A successful strike on a major naval combatant would cross a far higher deterrence threshold. That's where restraint becomes harder to sustain. Meanwhile, proxy networks in Iraq, Syria, or Yemen could activate, widening the battle space beyond the Gulf. Rocket fire, cross-border attacks, and maritime harassment create multiple fronts that strain coordination. Energy transit through Hormuz becomes a strategic hostage. Even partial disruption can jolt markets and draw international attention. At the strategic climax, the conflict stops being about isolated hits. It becomes about credibility, and whether either side believes the other is preparing to escalate further. That's when containment becomes most fragile. If the exchanges remain limited, the Gulf's security architecture will still change. Maritime choke points like the Strait of Hormuz are likely to see sustained militarization. More patrols, more escorts, more layered defenses. Presence becomes semi-permanent rather than episodic. Investment patterns will accelerate. Counter-drone systems, advanced missile interceptors, electronic warfare suites all move higher on procurement lists. Both regional states and external powers will adapt to a threat environment where logistics and support vessels are no longer assumed safe. But hardware alone doesn't determine trajectory. Diplomatic off-ramps remain possible, quiet mediation, de-escalation channels, tacit rules of engagement. Without them, confrontation risks becoming cyclical: strike, respond, recalibrate, repeat. The economic layer cannot be ignored. Insurance premiums for Gulf transit may remain elevated. Energy pricing could reflect a permanent risking premium tied to maritime volatility. So the central question endures: does this episode recalibrate deterrence, clarifying red lines and stabilizing expectations? Or does it normalize instability, embedding chronic maritime friction into one of the world's most vital corridors? The answer will depend less on capability and more on restraint